OCLC Research Library Partnership, which both underwrites and inspires our work. Attendees of this webinar are from the OCLC RLP, so I want to thank you for your continued support and input into our work. This is crucial to our success. So before I turn things over to our attendees, I want to just take a moment to connect this work to work that we do within the OCLC Research Library Partnership. So this is, of course, very connected to our work with equity, diversity, and inclusion. Starting in 2017, we did a survey on equity, diversity, and inclusion within the OCLC RLP, and that really helped to identify and lay out some challenge areas for us, primarily with descriptive practice. And the report, Reimagine Descriptive Workflows, is the result of a major effort, over a year's worth of effort, looking at drivers and necessary change points that are needed for reparative and inclusive description. And I think that many of the things that Rob and Elizabeth are going to be talking about relate to the themes in that report. But it also gives me an opportunity to reflect on this publication from 2008, Beyond the Silos of the Lambs, collaboration among libraries, archives, and museums, in which we looked at a number of, we did workshops with a number of different RLP institutions who are looking to bring together collections from our archives, libraries, and museums across a campus setting. And of course, some of those campuses are places like the Smithsonian. So it was kind of fun to take a look at this report, and particularly to look at Yale, who talked about the Yale Federation of Collections, which would provide, among other things, integrated access to collections information. So this was just kind of a fun look at some of our previous work that I think relates to our talk today. And with that, I am going to turn things over to Rob and Elizabeth for today's presentation. So take it away.
Thank you so much, and it is so nice to be here with all of you today. And I know Rob and I are both looking forward to the conversation at the end. That was one of the exciting parts about being able to make this presentation. So my name is Elizabeth. I am the Director of Cross Collection Initiatives in the Office of the Vice Provost for Collections and Scholarly Communication here at Yale.
Hi everyone, it's great to see so many attendees and so many familiar names and so many new ones. I'm Rob Sanderson, Director for Cultural Heritage Metadata here at Yale University. So Elizabeth and I are colleagues. I'm the more technical side, Elizabeth is the smarter side.
It's very generous. And here we are. So it's nice to be able to share our faces with you. And before we get started, we wanted to just make sure that we acknowledge the full committee that we have been working with, and I'll get into what that committee is. But they have been full contributors to this work and made many contributions to what we will be talking about today. So very grateful to Anna Arrays, Allison Clemens, Emmanuel Delmas-Glass, Benjamin Diebold, Aaron Gradell, Lindsay King, Sarah Brown, Gabriella Redwine, Marlene Theodore, David Thompson, Timothy Thompson, Edward Town, Jessica Utrip, and your Van Cohen. And I've seen already that several of them are on the call today, and hopeful that they'll chime in with additional contributions at the end of the presentation. So to give a quick overview of what we will be talking about today, we will briefly introduce Yale's collections and the context of our work, kind of what was phase one of our work, which involved the writing of a statement and a set of recommendations, a bit about the process that we've undertaken and some of the both challenges and lessons learned. And then we'll finish with some comments on our ongoing work, a few conclusions, and then get to the conversation part. So just before I get started, as I said before, we are very grateful that this is a work in progress series because we see all of our work as a work in progress and know that we've only scratched the surface in understanding cross-collection bias and racism. But to give the context here, these are the collecting institutions at Yale that we have been working with specific on this project. The Yale Center for British Art, the Yale University Art Gallery, the Yale University Library, and the Yale Peabody Museum of Natural History, which, relevant to this conversation, is currently under construction, closed for renovations, which underscores the need for digital access to its collection while its physical galleries are closed. So in total, these four collecting institutions at Yale care for 30 million items, and in pre-COVID times had about 660,000 visitors per year to our physical locations to access the physical collections. So I don't have a data point readily available on digital access, but we can imagine that it's much greater than that 660,000 in physical visits. So the work of our committee, which we call the Bias Awareness and Responsibility Committee, really began around a project known as LUX. So LUX, Yale Collections Discovery, is an ambitious multi-year project to create a single web-based platform to search Yale's collections. So for the first time, Yale's collections will be searchable through this single portal. And as you can imagine, the technical challenges of bringing together four sometimes similar, but usually very different collections into a single portal has been a huge lift. It has, however, activated a whole host of cross-collection committee work, which has been really tremendous to see, to address different aspects of the project. We expect LUX to launch in 2023. And about 2 years ago, with the development of this new portal, it seemed like a very important time and frankly, a sort of extraordinary opportunity to really think about how to build a system that acknowledges deep-seated bias in our collections, in our cataloging, in our historic descriptive practices, but also one that sort of considers the experience of users and works to ensure that their experience is a positive one. So our work as a committee began in late summer 2020, and we were tasked with considering issues of implicit and explicit bias within the knowledge systems that manage our heritage collection data. And specifically, in this first phase of work, we were tasked with two deliverables. One, the articulation of a values statement to guide the work of LUX and the development of LUX. And then two, a set of recommendations and a plan of action for implementing this work. So we assembled a committee comprised of representatives from each of our collecting units, those that we acknowledged earlier in this presentation. There have been different iterations and people rolling in and out of the committee, but we have had very diverse representation from across our collecting units. And we began kind of thinking about how does one begin to think about articulating core values and expressing that in a statement? How do we ensure that these articulated values are actually realized versus just stuck up on a page? Who is our audience and who are we sort of making a statement to and for? So as we began this work, our initial phase was heavily discussion-based. We were building community amongst ourselves. We were looking to many outside examples, learning, researching, building a shared understanding of of what other organizations were doing and sort of trying to determine how we could move this work forward. So there were two useful tools that we used in this early phase of our work. The first was Zotero Bibliography. And as we were looking at LibGuides and organizational statements on anti-racism and scholarly articles and programs and blog posts on applicable topics, we began to read and discuss and annotate to develop a sense of how we might begin to articulate values. We found Stanford's Special Collections and Archive Statement very clear. We also, and this work was just mentioned, Smithsonian, we were talking about it earlier this morning. We really liked the value statement expressed on the Smithsonian's open access website. We very much realized through all of this work that we wanted an action statement that takes responsibility for past action and that proactively thinks about the future, not just a disclaimer that there might be harmful content that you will encounter. So Zotero was very useful and continues to be a really useful way for us as a committee to capture resources we continue to discover, new literature, et cetera, and additional examples that we can add to that bibliography. The other tool that we used was a Trello board, and you'll see a screenshot of that work that we did, really thinking about early in our process, we acknowledged the need for some shared vocabulary around this work. We needed to kind of speak the same language, if you will. So we began to identify words and phrases that felt important. We were pulling some of these out of the reading we were doing, and then just really discussing them, putting them on the table and saying, what do we mean when we say we value transparency? What are we actually talking about? When we say bias, what do we actually mean? And then we began to prioritize these words, what were core to our thinking or our project, and maybe what didn't feel as central to the work as we saw it. This was a hard process, but it was a really productive way of laying groundwork and getting on the same page as a committee. So here you will see where we ultimately landed with our core terminology. Of course, bias, it's embedded in the name of our committee, and we talked a lot about bias in the beginning, how everything is biased, how we are biased, but we wanted to be clear that we were focusing in this instance on the oppressive and harmful biases that that kind of haunt our collections, if you will, and that being the focus. Inclusivity, we talked quite a bit about that, and the need for sort of ensuring that we were casting a wider net for participation, both across our collections and kind of internally, but also thinking about who would be using this Lux platform and their experience. Transparency, a lot of conversation around our transparency of our processes, our working processes, and wanting to make sure that we were actively being transparent, thinking about provenance and the ways that we that this would be an opportunity to provide additional information about object histories. And then just in our records, so how could we be transparent if a record is changed, how that kind of history in the data is made available to a user. Awareness, we talked a lot about the importance of our committee in raising awareness around our work through trainings, through bringing in outside experts, through being kind of connective tissue between ourselves and other committees that were working on Lux and the local units, our collecting units. The responsibility and accountability of intent, the ethics of all of it, and changing the acceptable standards of conduct. We talked quite a bit about anti-racism and anti-oppression, of course, and ultimately landed with anti-oppression as a core term, feeling that it was that it moved beyond just racism. Dignity, respecting and dignifying all individuals and cultures, and wanting that to be an embedded part of what Lux conveys. Humility, the need for ourselves and our colleagues and to possess humility and know that we do not have all of the answers, and looking to other organizations, large and small, and people to really inform our process. And then just equitable processes and presentation. And we've talked a lot about that in the development of the user interface, etc. So these are the secondary and related terminology. I won't go into all of them. As you can imagine, it was hard to kind of make a determination in many of these cases between what was core and what was secondary, but you can kind of get a sense of all of the words and the phrases that we put on the table, and spent a lot of time kind of parsing out and coming up with some shared definitions. So after all of this work, we turned to the statement itself. And as we began the process of writing and editing, we sort of sat with, who is making this statement? Why are they making this statement? How are they making this statement? And to whom are they making this statement? Trying to figure out kind of audience and who we were writing on behalf of. And we kind of came to the conclusion that in many ways we were writing to ourselves, that this would be a publicly available statement written on behalf of the collections in many ways, but one that, as much as anything, we hoped would prompt buy-in across the collections. And recognizing, and Rob will get into this a little bit, but in the recommendations, it would ultimately be up to the local units in many ways to do certain kinds of data remediation, et cetera. So wanting the statement to represent some of that. So we ultimately decided to be brief, we hope you feel that way, and succinct, and then we would offer further explanation and clarity in the set of recommendations we were making. So this is the statement that we came up with. You'll see in blue many of these words that we spent a lot of time going into in depth, highlighted or incorporated into this statement. Lux exposes longstanding and deep bias within our acquisition activities, collection systems, and descriptive practices. Some content and the description of that content is outmoded, racist, and culturally insensitive. Yale's cultural heritage institutions commit to identifying and addressing these issues, and also to being transparent about documenting such processes. Individually and collectively, the institutions seek to treat users with respect, ensuring dignity is extended to all those who created or are represented in Yale's collections. This includes numerous groups who historically have been marginalized and systemically silenced, whose perspectives, expertise, and authority will contribute to the direction of Lux's future. So this statement and the subsequent recommendations that Rob will share with you was approved and adopted by the Yale Cultural Heritage IT Steering Committee, which is comprised of folks from across the collections, including the directors of the museums and libraries. So a few notes on our process. I'm going to just sort of walk through norms and reflection, a little bit about collaboration, and just our engagement with colleagues, and just the aspiration to have inclusive working processes. So as we were working on an externally facing statement and recommendations, we began to talk about how we needed to develop norms for how not just our group needed to be operating, but for all of the groups in the Lux project, how the work of bias awareness and responsibility needed to be kind of acknowledged and inform the way that all of these committees were working. So each working committee of Lux actually went through a process of discussing and developing norms. These are, in quotations, the norms that we developed as the BARC committee, the Bias Awareness and Responsibility Committee. We all should have done this in the earliest stages of Lux, but better late than never. And it was a really productive process for us to engage with other committees in this specific work. I think it's important to note, and we've all felt this in different ways in COVID times, but these are all really challenging topics to be discussed by Zoom, by people from different parts of the university. So perhaps it wasn't perfect, but we feel good that we did it, and it's something that we can return to ensure that we are kind of operating in an equitable way in our committee cultures. This work has been deeply collaborative. As hopefully you saw very quickly in the beginning, all of our collecting units are included, and we have diverse representation in terms of the types of work, the kind of work that our committee members do, which has been very helpful to kind of consider the work from different angles. There, of course, is always a tension between sort of size and representation. I will say that our Bias Awareness Responsibility Committee, many of our members sit on other committees within Lux, and so they are kind of the connective tissue to understanding what is happening with the kind of physical system build out or other technical issues with Lux, which is very productive, but it's also a lot to ask of any one person. So there has been some tension there, but in general, very collaborative. And then just in terms of how we have engaged with other colleagues, those who are not involved with Lux, but very much part of thinking of issues of access with digital collections in particular, but just collections more broadly. This and the subsequent slide that you'll see was part of a staff survey that we did. And you know, one of the things we've talked extensively about is the need to cast a wide net and ensure that we are getting feedback and input from a very, very, the widest group possible. This survey was one way that we did that to begin to kind of better understand the experience of our colleagues. We intended to survey other folks, including faculty and students and other community members beyond Yale. We did not get to those things. Of course, dedicated time is an issue, but I would say that this is something that we discussed a lot and executed on a little bit less, but we would like to think about as we kind of continue our work in the future, how we're making space for the incorporation and inclusion of other voices. But this survey certainly did help inform our thinking about recommendations. You'll see here we asked some questions about remediation policies, et cetera. On the next slide, you'll see that we asked questions about types of information that could be useful here. What are the benefits and the challenges for providing information about people? And so these questions helped us think about the recommendations that we then kind of began writing. And with that, I will turn it over to Rob to share with you the recommendations.
Great, thank you, Elizabeth. So yes, once we had finalized the statement and worked through the details of the staff survey, we moved on to our recommendations deliverable, which covers 4 major areas: the user interactions, recommendations about user interactions in the Lux platform, unit level metadata changes, because as an aggregator, Lux can't do much to remediate across the board. Communications and outreach, of course, absolutely essential, and that this is ongoing work and will always be ongoing work. It's not a project to fix something and then move on. It is a cultural shift within the organization that needs to continue to evolve over time. So first about the LUX interactions, we wanted to make sure that our values and the activities that were being performed in this area were as visible as possible, so as prominent as would be allowed within the platform, to ensure that it was understood not only internally that this was necessary and important, but also externally. To allow for feedback from users and the community, LUX and our culture must allow the audience to participate, particularly in cultural heritage. We are not the experts. The cultures from whence the heritage comes clearly know more about it than we do. So to tell us that something is wrong, we need to have a way for that to happen, which I'll get to in the next slide. And finally, towards metadata, the contextualization of content is important. Not everything can be changed, so we need to be able to help folks to understand why it exists as it does. Communication, absolutely essential in such a collaborative and challenging area. We want to ensure that the efforts that are necessary are integrated within all of the units within their workflows, because again, this is certainly not a one-off project. It is a cultural shift. And to that point, the work is ongoing and needs strategic consideration as to resourcing, amount of effort, and so forth. It needs venues for the safe and respectful discussion and understanding and learning about the topics, because we are all learners in the space, and outreach for awareness of the work internally and externally. So we had some great work done by a colleague, Monica Ong-Reed, in the Digital Humanities Lab to put together a service blueprint for how to guide users from the various pages and interactions within the LUX platform, such that they felt comfortable and empowered to provide useful feedback, and that then that feedback could be acted upon within a timely fashion. So this service blueprint is definitely too small for you to see, apologies for that, but essentially walks from the different pages through a form. Then the last three are triage by issue, so some central triage, then triage by the institution, such that the issue can be directed to the right place, and then it can be received and acted upon, which would be the next part of the blueprint. One of the big topics, of course, of the recommendations was the need to create a metadata action plan in each of the participating units. First and foremost, resourcing and prioritization is needed for such a plan. It's no good having a document that says what would be nice to do without any people to actually enact those recommendations. So the first recommendation in this area is all units must have a plan, which includes resourcing. Then we talked about 4 different areas and recommended that the plan should address each of these in turn. So there are 2 different sources of information that need remediation, or at least consideration. The original content, such as the painting itself, or the title of the book, versus the metadata about it, which would be created by the unit staff. Clearly, the original content is much harder to change than the metadata. Then types of information that should be considered. Information about people is important for privacy, respect, and dignity reasons. Culturally sensitive items and how they should be appropriately rendered digitally. And then the differences between text and image. It's much easier to change text in a computer than it is to change an image. Then the types of issues that we wanted to call out were oppression or oppressive biases, in particular racism, but also violence as something which is harmful and traumatic. Then selection biases were of interest. How can we be clearer around the collecting and describing practices of our institution as to what is part of Lux and what is not? And finally, transparency, as Elizabeth already described. Then we highlighted 5 different types of possible remediation. The offending content could be simply deleted, could be just removed completely. If it was a mistake, then or outmoded, then it could be corrected. Clearly, those wouldn't apply for everything. So there is this need to be able to contextualize the content as it stands, such that people understand why it is there. Equally, to have a warning to say that there is challenging material that you are about to encounter, and give the user the agency to decide whether they want to interact with that content or not. And of course, no change is still a possible outcome. The units are responsible for their own descriptions and content, and they may very well decide that although there was a report, there was feedback, and that something was offensive, that no change is actually necessary in that particular case. So we have the 4 very diverse units with many different collections. That brings us several challenges to the Lux space. In particular, these are around multiple domains of descriptive practice and descriptive content, the scale in aggregate and individually, whether we should aim for consistency or merely coherence. The distributed data sources is a challenge, which I'll get to, and also this notion of feedback and how we can route discussions appropriately. So across the collections, we have 2 different art museums, the Natural History Museum, the Peabody, the library collection, special collections, and archives. So as an example, I thought, I don't want to have just words on the slide. So what could be totally inoffensive that would span at least across the art galleries and the Natural History Museum? So I searched for zebra. So the first is a painting by George Stubbs. The one to its right is a wonderful little sculpture in the Peabody in the anthropological collections. Then I searched in the archives for zebra, thinking, well, there might be something. And indeed, male nude on zebra skin diagonal position, with a photograph that I did not include in the slide. So even with positively innocuous searches like zebra, it's not difficult to run into potentially challenging topics. But within these contexts, while zebra isn't challenging, the nudity might be. However, nudity in artwork is expected. There are many paintings of both the male and female form and other genders, of course, which are much less challenging than perhaps the male nude on a zebra skin photograph from the archives, where you would not be mentally or emotionally prepared for such thing, perhaps. Equally, titles or other content differ across domains. It's very, you can't change an offensive book title. However, painting titles or artwork titles are often much less fixed in stone, and they can be changed or at the very least contextualized. Then on to scale, as I was mentioned, there's some 30 million objects altogether, only 15 million of which have digital records that describe them. But those 15 million records get partitioned out into 45 million entity records. As you'll see in a minute, we distinguish between people, places, concepts, events, works, and objects as different records. So this makes it very hard to see the rotten wood for the size of the forest, and at the same time makes it very difficult to manually remediate thousands of very similar but not identical issues. We can't just do a global search replace of alien for immigrant, of course, in the collection. That would ruin all of the science fiction topics. Then equally, there is a challenge of scale across the different collections. The ILS has some 12 million bibliographic records, making it one of the largest single library collections in North America, whereas the Yale Centre for British Art only has 65,000, give or take, object records. So we can't expect the same level of engagement with the content in the library as in the centre. It would take many years to even look at each record in the library, spending only a second or two on each record. Whereas it's quite possible to go through the Yale Centre for British Arts collection completely and do a very thorough assessment. So it's easier to add context, of course, with these smaller scale data sets, but that doesn't solve the challenge across the board. So here is a sneak peek at the very much work in progress LUX. There is, you will see a lack of images, a lack of content, a lack of functionality. So where it says refine, there will be facets, we just haven't implemented them yet. So we have a tabbed interface for objects, works, people, and organizations, places, concepts, and events. So I did a search for nude just as a interesting relevant query. There were 842 physical things in our collections that match nude. 4,000 works, mostly text, of course, matching nude. 51 people matching nude, thankfully not actually nudes, but nuding and other stemmed forms of the word. No places, also thankfully. 96 concepts, such as photography of the nude and art, and 117 events, all of which are acquisitions of objects which can have nude in the title. So events in LUX are things like acquisitions, exhibitions, and so on. Then an object record would be like this. You can see the references to the printer and the original artist, where it is at Yale, and so on. The top is AAAF and one of the AAAF clients. Then if you were to click on Michelangelo, you would be taken to this record. So where do we get all of this information from? We don't, of course, have all of this in any system at Yale. We can harvest, as part of LUX, information from authority records. So the new discussion in the PCC about not cataloging gender is of great interest to us because we use it. Also, Wikidata and other sources of information. So we then want to aim for coherence rather than consistency because of these cross-domain and scale challenges. We can't sort of enforce a consistent set of rules and processes everywhere because of the different domains, the different approaches, the different content, and the different scales of the collections. So we need to not be rigidly consistent because we won't, we would never achieve that, but the results of the work should hopefully be at least somewhat coherent. Again, this contextualization of the content is critical, particularly around images that can't be changed. And of course, we're a university, our mission is to educate, so this fits in nicely with our overall mission. As I mentioned, we have a distributed set of data sources, both internally and externally within LUX. So we aggregate from the Yale Centre for British Art, Yale University Art Gallery, Yale Peabody Museum, and then two different systems in the library, the ILS, which is Voyager, and ArchiveSpace for the archives. We also intend to increase this in the future to other internal collections. But we also want to enrich those records from external authorities, such as the Getty authorities, AAT, ULAN and TGN, Library of Congress, LCNAF and LCSH, our hosts, OCLC, thankfully make FAST and VF available. Also Wikidata, the German National Library's information, and to spatial authorities or gazetteers, GeoNames, and Who's On First. So this, of course, brings multiple challenges. Wikidata can be edited at any point by anyone and will likely include information that we may not want to render. That can be fixed in Wikidata, of course. It can also be unfixed. Birth dates, gender are all interesting, which is why we focused on people for that survey for what would be of benefit and what would provide challenges. Then feedback. In such a distributed environment, it's quite challenging to route the feedback to the right place from these merged and enriched records. So if there was a problem with that Michelangelo record, did it come from the library? Did it come from one of the museums? Or did it come from one of the external authorities that we use to enrich the display? So every piece of feedback will need to be triaged before merely looking up which object is being talked about and sending it off to the institution. So we definitely need this service plan, and as part of the plan, we anticipate that this triage process will necessitate longer response times than we might otherwise like, as there is a limited amount of time and an awful lot of data to look at. As ongoing work, we are working with a wonderful student, Hannah Vaz, who's here in the webinar, to try to help the units to understand the scale of the issues by methodically walking through some vocabularies of challenging terms and searching in turn in each of the units' collections to see how many records might match those terms, and then assessing each record. Is this possibly challenging, likely challenging? Is there some obvious remediation that could be applied? Then the feedback process and the user interface to make that communication relevant and useful and encouraged is ongoing work. We do not have a solution for how to staff up that process such that we could get the turnaround time of any particular topic below, we imagine, around 7 days. There is continuous and collaborative learning, and of course there is ongoing remediation work, especially in the archives with some great work happening there at the moment. So our current conclusions, again, work in progress. These may change and will hopefully change based on the discussion in chat and after the presentations. We have this public statement focusing on our core values. We think this is really important, that it is an action statement which is backed by action. It's not just intent, and for it to be publicized as wide as possible. The need for a sustainable plan for cultural change. We can't do this as a one-off project. We accession objects much faster than we can possibly describe them. So there is, we need to ensure that the descriptive work is as valuable as possible as it goes through the system. The challenges are very different for different domains and with different scales of those collections. Then the cross-domain and cross-source multiplies these challenges, but at the same time, it multiplies the benefits of being able to engage with all of our cultural assets in a single platform. The recognition and naming of the difficult aspects of the work helped us an awful lot and continues to do so. So it's much easier to engage with something when it's recognized. And it's much easier to talk about when everyone understands that same language and can associate a name with the thing that is being discussed. And finally, collaboration across the units and across committees in a safe space where people understand that we speak in draft as one of our norms is absolutely crucial. Everyone is learning, everyone wants to do the right thing. We all want to improve both ourselves and the content. So thank you so much for your attention, and we would absolutely welcome any questions, comments, feedback, suggestions, ideas to us now, or our email addresses are there on the slide. Please do get in touch afterwards if something comes to mind.
Yes, thank you so much, Rob and Elizabeth. I do see a couple of questions, but I'm going to go ahead and encourage people to go ahead and enter those into chat. Be sure that the option is to everyone. I have a quick question, which is the service blueprint, which we saw the tiny version of. Do you have a version of that that's larger that could be shared? That's a pretty important contribution, I think.
Yep. Yeah, we certainly have a larger version. I would need to check with both the committee and Monica how shareable it is at the current state. But yes, I don't see any particular problems.
Super. I know that there's colleagues who would definitely benefit from that. So Bianca has a question here, and then also a question earlier that I'll crawl my way back up to. But this question: do you have a sense of what the minimal resource requirements are for managing managing the user feedback? And if so, because you said that in the that each unit needs to have a plan for remediation and that must be resourced. So is that something that you looked at as a group, or does each unit kind of arrive at that on their own? I'm interpreting Bianca's question a little bit, so I hope I got that right.
Yeah. So Elizabeth, jump in with anything that I miss or misspeak. But our current plan, which we have not put into practice yet, so when we try it, it may completely fail, is to have a meeting every week to go through that initial triage of how are the feedback comments useful to some units, be that ITS, who's responsible for the actual technology, or for the collecting units, or for the platform as a whole. And if so, what sort of issue is being reported, and then take it to the right place. So we anticipate that is sort of 5 or 6 people every week for an hour or two. That's maybe optimistic. It's maybe completely naive. We don't know how much feedback we are going to get. Then, as part of that metadata plan, there is a process requirement that the units be able to receive that feedback and do something with it. That the remediation or the content to be remediated might come from internal sources of just going through our descriptions and assets, or it might come from external sources equally. So yeah, I'm afraid we don't have a very good idea yet, just because we haven't tried it. We don't have feedback to practice with yet.
Right.
Elizabeth, do you have anything to add to that one?
I think just to sort of chime in to say a lot of these conversations have been around the fact that there's no single person that this can go to, that the feedback has to be kind of co-managed across the collections, and there's no organizational apparatus fully that supports that. So that has been kind of the nature of those conversations, but that if we are going to collect feedback, and this relates to the other question about how we sideline trust, which is kind of is core to this, that we want users to be able to trust that the system, that we are addressing it, and that you will actually have some kind of resolution or at least response to the feedback that you give.
Thank you. And of course, trust is something that's developed over time and based on experience. So yeah. So Bianca's other question was in reference to the shared terminology that was brought together in Trello, and asks if you can talk a little bit more about the concepts that were set aside, like trust, dissemination, preservation, and maybe say a few words about why those were set to the side.
It's a great question, and it's really interesting to look back on it now, because it's sort of what I was getting at a moment ago. I feel like trust is really essential in all of this, both in the work of the committee, but also in how we want to work with users. Rob, do you recall those set aside terms with any specificity? It's been some time since we've kind of gone through and parsed out. I mean, I would just say, the work has evolved over time, and we've gotten more into the details and the recommendations. It would have been interesting if we had gone back to look at all of those terms to see if anything had changed. I might make an argument for trust being more central, or arguing that it is far more core than maybe we articulated in the first place. But do you remember any of the conversation there?
Yeah, if I recall correctly, and yeah, as Elizabeth said, this is quite a while ago that we made these decisions. So preservation we felt was important, but not bias related. So we did talk about it, how it's important, but of course it's not. The bias is selection bias as to what to preserve. Representation, if I recall correctly, it was that we could not do a lot about representativeness of the collections for multiple reasons. There are collecting strategies, some of which are simply required by the foundation of the units. Dissemination, we thought, is a process for the committee, but not a topic for the statement. It must be disseminated. That sort of falls under awareness and transparency. And trust is indeed the tricky one. I don't recall why we left it out, other than perhaps it was a desired outcome of the work that the collections and the institution are trusted, as opposed to the work itself, which is, of course, to remediate the inherent implicit and explicit biases and challenging material within the collections. Yeah, trust, I think, could easily be promoted out of that set aside bucket.
Thank you. That was a great discussion and reflection. Here's one more question. This may be the last question that we have time for. You mentioned vocabularies or lists of challenging terms that you use for kind of assessing the corpus and searching across it. Did you develop those yourselves, and might those be available for other institutions to use for doing their own assessment?
So the one that Hannah and I have been using to start off with, and this is very much new work in progress, was developed at the Getty Research Institute by Kelly Davis and others there, which I happen to know because up until 2020 I worked at the Getty and know them very well. So that is, I believe, going to be made public, or if you were to get in touch, I'm sure that they would be happy to share it with you in its current state as well.
Fabulous. Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm not seeing other questions, and we are pretty much at the end of our time together. So I want to take this opportunity to thank you, Rob and Elizabeth, for a really wonderful presentation, for sharing this work that is very much in progress. We have been recording this webinar. We will share this back to you along with a link to where you can get a copy of the slides. So thank you all so much for your attention and robust discussion today. I want to take a moment to thank you, and this concludes today's webinar. Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.